Hi there. Welcome to the SBC Daily Word for Monday, February 1st. We made it all the way through January. Checking in here from my basement corner. I hope that you survived the snow we had over the weekend. I also, SBC family, am looking very much forward to us being together this coming weekend on Saturday evening at 5 p.m. and on Sunday morning at 10 a.m. We're going to be looking this morning at James chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. James chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. Again, James, we believe this is the James who we know as the brother of Jesus, who also became a leader in the church at Jerusalem. Oftentimes in the book of Acts, we see James functioning in that leadership role. And as a Jewish Christian, he has responsibility to shepherd a church of Jewish Christians, and he's trying to help them understand, in light of the persecution they are undergoing at the hands of the Roman Empire, that they can still be considered, in spite of the fact that they've been scattered throughout the Mediterranean world, they can still be faithful to Torah by following Jesus. And that's an important detail, especially to keep in mind as we look here at the first 6 verses of James chapter 4, because the community to whom James is writing is a community that finds themselves very uninfluential. They find themselves being pushed to the margins of society. And one of the things that we're going to see in James chapter 4 is that they are tempted to be shaped into the image of those who are oppressing them. And this is very relevant for the church in the first few months of 2021. We feel in a lot of ways scattered. We feel in a lot of ways maybe pushed to the margins. And this is a whole debatable topic, but I think we do feel ourselves wielding less and less influence in American culture. And I wonder if perhaps we are being tempted by the same spirits that James' community is being tempted by, to perhaps pick up the weapons of power and of rebellion and of resistance to try to gain back influence, to try to gain back something more at the center of society. And what James reminds us of is that that is not the way of peace. That is not the way of Jesus. That is not the way of transformation that Jesus calls us to. So, a little bit of context here. James chapter 4 comes after James chapter 3. And that's critical always, but especially in our understanding of what's going on in James chapter 4. James chapter 3 has been predominantly about teachers in the community and those teachers using their tongues in appropriate ways. Now, having addressed the problem of teaching in the community, now James is going to begin to pick up some of the pieces from the mess that these teachers had caused in the Christian community. So he's kind of going to be addressing some of the same issues. He's still got the teachers in mind, but now he's beginning to pull in the community, those who listen to the teaching. Now, ultimately, if you were to ask James, what is the effect of bad teaching in the church? James would immediately, without thinking, say division. A lack of unity is the fruit of poor teaching. So we're kind of going to break up verses 1 to 12 into 2 different units. We're going to look at verses 1 to 6. So today is the problem of a divided church, part 1. Tomorrow will be the problem of a divided church, part 2. So the problem of a divided church, as James is prone to do, like a good Jewish teacher, just like Jesus was a good Jewish teacher, he begins to address an issue with a question. James chapter 4, verse 1. Those conflicts and disputes among you, where do they come from? Now, this could be referring to literal violence, okay? The idea here is of conflicts and sorting, like a strange English verb there that we're not familiar with, but conflicts and sorting. This could be referring to literal violence, okay? The words that James uses are used in other places in the New Testament, and it could be metaphorical, it could be literal, that people in James' church were taking up arms against each other, and perhaps even calling others to take up arms against the Roman government. So James could be kind of rooting out the residue of kind of this neo-zealot Christianity. So do you remember back in the Gospels, Jesus calls disciples? And he calls disciples, some of whom when he called them were fishermen, but then others had different occupations. We had Matthew, the tax collector, who kind of worked for that first century Roman IRS. And then we had, again, one of these first disciples, Simon the Zealot. Remember him? A zealot was somebody who thought that God called God's people to take up arms, okay? To seek to violently overthrow the government. And Jesus is drawn to one of these first century zealots, and he calls him to repent, just like Peter and Andrew and James and John had left their fishing occupation, just like Levi or Matthew had left his tax collecting occupation. So Simon leaves this identity of a zealot and tells him that that is not the way the kingdom is going to come. Now, it could be within James' community that there are people who have that in their story. And that's now because of the persecution, they're perhaps being tempted to go back. Remember at the end of John's gospel, when they think the story has ended and they're not yet sure if Jesus has risen from the dead, what do many of the disciples return to? They return to fishing. Well, it could be that perhaps these zealots that had been called to Jesus and who are now being persecuted, they could be returning to their former ways of life. And they could be, even within the local church, be engaging in violence against each other, or perhaps in a bigger way, could be seeking to engage in violence against the government. James, the brother of Jesus, is against that. So, where do these violent disputes come from is the question. Now in the second half of verse 1, he's going to answer that question. Do they not come from your cravings that are at war within you? So now James is again talking to and about teachers and the effect that they're having now on the community. So James is still kind of teaching these teachers, listen, what's going on in this community is because of the teaching that you have done. And what's taking place is these unhealthy desires from the teachers are now spreading amongst the pupils of those teachers. Now, verses 2 and 3, he's going to kind of explore that answer. You want something, verse 2, and do not have it, so you commit murder. Again, this could be literal things that are going on. It could be metaphorical. It could be both. But again, just like Jesus does in the Sermon on the Mount, he sees the violence as a symptom of something else. Where does murder come from? It comes from wanting something but not having it. So wrong desire produces murder. And second half of verse 2, you covet something and cannot obtain it. So you engage in, there's that phrase again, disputes and conflicts, sorting, literally. Okay? You ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly in order to spend what you get on your pleasures. So, misguided desire produces murder. Misguided desire produces conflict. Misguided desire, verse 3, produces selfish prayer. Okay? So now James has introduced the question, he's answered it, and then he's kind of drilled down to understand that this conflict is coming from a misguided, unhealthy envy within the teachers. Now in verses 4 to 6, okay, having introduced that whole topic, he's going to now unpack the problem with divisiveness, okay? The problem with divisiveness in the church. Verse 4, this attention-grabbing accusation. Adulterers, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God. Or do you suppose that it is for nothing that the Scripture says, God yearns jealously for the Spirit that He has made to dwell in us? But He gives all the more grace. Therefore it says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. So again, this is under the overall umbrella of divisiveness in the church. And what divisiveness in the church reveals is friendship with the world. Okay? So two things that James is going to say. Divisiveness reveals that we have, in an unhealthy way, entered into friendship with the world. Now again, friendship in its first century context is much more intimate and much more covenant and much more committed than we use the word friendship. We in our culture use the phrase, we're just friends. In James' context, they would never do that. Friendship meant mutual commitment, mutual sacrifice. And what James is now saying is, when divisiveness plagues a church, what that means is they have entered into friendship with the world, and if they have entered into that covenant commitment with the world, then that places them at enmity with God. Now let's back up a little bit and kind of understand what has led James to say these things. This church, led by these teachers, have engaged in zeal, ambition, craving, desire for power, and this reveals that this church is characterized by friendship with a system that is propped up with a coercive desire for power. You see, what is taking place is these teachers in the church that James is writing to, and then the pupils of those teachers have become so infatuated with that force that is spreading them around the Mediterranean world. They have become so focused on their persecutors that they have become like the ones who are persecuting them. And the ones that have the power in their minds, who are pushing them away from the center of society, they have become so focused on the enemy that they are now being shaped into the image of that enemy. Divisiveness in the church flows from an envy which is antithetical to the spirit of friendship God has given. See, God says, listen, I have given you a spirit, and that spirit is there so that God and the church can be in this mutual friendship, no enmity connection. And then now what is taking place is this church's desire for power and influence, that envy for those things has sabotaged their connection with God. So I love what James does here as a good pastor. He doesn't speak to them and say, God's done with you because you're going the way of Rome in your search for power. No, he says, God zealously longs for friendship with you, and you're now turning your back on friendship with God by reaching for political power, by reaching for influence, so much so that you desire that's leading you then to engage in violence. Brothers and sisters, the church in our day needs to hear the same wisdom from James. In different ways, we feel pushed to the fringes of culture in different ways. Sometimes we're despised for our beliefs. In different ways, we're looked down upon by those we perceive who have the power and the influence. And we have been offered a temptation. Enter into friendship with political power, and we'll restore you to your rightful place in culture. And what James says to us in that moment is we are turning our backs on friendship with God, and not so much leaving that relationship as neutral, but we are at enmity with God when we seek to play the games the world plays. So how can we apply this wisdom to our lives? A couple of applications. One, we are what we want. We are what we want. So there's violence, there's division, there's conflict in the church that James is writing to. And where does James go to address that? He goes to their desires. You see, he's a good disciple of Jesus. Jesus, the first words out of his mouth in John's gospel, look it up if you have a red letter edition. The very first question Jesus asks in John's gospel, just like James asks questions, Jesus asks us in John's gospel, what do you want? And then one of the last questions that Jesus asks in John's gospel is to Peter, who's asked, do you love me? Do you love me? You see, James understands that the violence, the division, the conflict in his community is not something where he can just come to them and say, stop it. No, he goes to them and says to them, let me talk to you about your desires. Jesus says the first and greatest commandment is to love. That's a desire word, to love God with our heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love our neighbor as ourselves. We are what we want. So when things are going wrong, when there is sin in our lives, when there is violence in our lives, when there is conflict and division in our lives, we don't approach that by saying, how can I work up the willpower to stop it? We then ask the question, no, what is it that I'm desiring that perhaps is misordered? What idolatry is that sin revealing? So our first application of this wisdom is we are what we want. Second, the world. Jesus helps us as disciples. He helps us view the world the way he does. And James, as a good disciple of Jesus, views the world the same way his brother viewed the world. And how did they both view the world? They viewed the world this way. The world is opposed to God because it is fueled by envy. Envy is the energy that makes the world system run. Envy. Just think about it this way. Whatever we desire, whatever we want to spend our money on, how does that become something that we desire? It becomes something we desire because we've seen a targeted ad on our Facebook wall. We've seen a commercial. We've seen somebody whose power, influence, and good looks we want. They wear those shoes. Their glasses are like that. They have a beard now, or they cut their hair like that, or they wear those jeans, or they have that phone, or they like that music. Envy, this desire to have what other people have, and then to imitate those people and what they have and what they like, is really what makes the capitalism economy in our nation run. And it's envy. It's desiring what other people have, so much so that if I don't have that, I might even be willing to engage in violence to get it. Both Matthew and Mark tell us, Matthew in Matthew 27:18 and Mark in Mark 15:10, tell us that it was envy. Your translation might have jealousy, same kind of concept here, that led the Jewish leaders of Jesus' day to hand him over to the Roman authorities to murder him. The world that is opposed to God is fueled by envy. Brothers and sisters, envy will short circuit our connection with God. It's envy that leads to division in the church. Remember the Titans is one of those sports movies that even people who aren't into sports can really like. During a time in America where schools were being desegregated, something we as followers of Jesus, the Jewish Messiah, should support and get behind, but yet it's still a very complicated, a very potentially divisive time. And remember, the Titans is the story of a football coach played by Denzel Washington who is chosen to coach the team of a school district that's just been desegregated. And he takes them all to camp, football camp at the end of the summer. And he basically has two teams. And the coach that he replaces stays on as an assistant coach. And there's just this hostility. There's this division that takes place. And towards the end of camp, as the division and the conflict is getting to its apex, the two captains, the one African-American captain named Julius, and then the white captain named Jerry, come together. And they begin to talk to each other. They begin to develop a relationship. And that relationship begins to boil over into conflict between them. And they're angry with each other about the way the African-American players and the way that the white players are fighting against each other and not working together. And then finally, Julius, the African-American captain, says to Jerry, the white captain, "Can I tell you how I see it?" And he says to him, "The attitude reflects the leadership." In other words, the white players are not blocking well for the black players because of the leadership you are giving them. Brothers and sisters, that's an image that kind of helps us understand what's going on. There's leaders in the church to which James writes. And he says to the teachers and he says to the pupils, the attitude is always going to reflect the leadership. So again, that brings us back again to what fruit does the teaching to which we expose ourselves produce in our lives? Brothers and sisters, if teaching leads to conflict, it is not Christian teaching. If teaching leads to reconciliation, if teaching leads to unity, that is teaching that is in line with the way of Jesus. May grace and peace and everything good be yours.